Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Rice University virtually. I'm Faye Yarbrough, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of History, and I'm also an associate dean in the School of Humanities. And it's my privilege to welcome you and to moderate this panel entitled The Red Book of Houston, an Early 20th Century Black Proclamation. We're joined by 4 panelists this evening. I will introduce them here very briefly because I know you'd rather hear from them than to hear me introduce them for a long time. Then each panelist will offer remarks for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open things up to your questions. Please feel free to use the Q&A feature to ask your questions. The chat has been disabled for attendees, but we're happy to answer questions via the Q&A feature. So to introduce our panelists. First, we are going to hear from Norie Guthrie. She is an archivist and special collections librarian at Rice University's Woodson Research Center. She's too modest to say it herself, but she really spearheaded and guided the data collection for this project. She'll give you an overview of the Red Book and the associated website, and then I'll put links to those in the chat. Next, we'll have Cary Wintz, who is a professor of history at Texas Southern University. Wintz is the author of several books, including Harlem Speaks, Black Culture and the Harlem Renaissance, African American Political Thought, 1890 to 1930, and Texas, the Lone Star State. He plans to talk about the history of Fourth Ward in Houston. Our third panelist will be Bernadette Pruitt, who is an associate professor of history from Sam Houston State University. She's the author of The Other Great Migration, the movement of rural African Americans to Houston, 1900 to 1941, and we'll discuss African American migration to Houston. Our final panelist is Karen Kasitarnichev, who is also a professor of history at Texas Southern University. She is the author of African Americans in Central Texas history and has written about Lillian Horace Jones. She will talk about African American history in Municipal District B. So without further ado, here are our panelists. Let's begin with Norie Guthrie.
Hi, everyone. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, I hope everybody can see everything. All right, so I'm going to now kind of go through the story map that we've created based on data that we were able to take out of the Red Book of Houston. And for anybody who doesn't know, the Red Book of Houston was created in 1915 by members of Houston's Black community. And it was kind of a way to show the changes that they had undergone in the last 50 years from emancipation. So go ahead and get started. So the Red Book itself is filled with lots of addresses, home addresses, business addresses, teachers' home addresses, church addresses, schools, etc. And that has all been extracted and placed here on the map. And so we're going to kind of keep going through all these different bits, but you can click on any of those points and find more information, sometimes images too. So just to get this started, we think about throughout the book, there are biographies, and within those biographies, there are sometimes the participants mention when they moved to Houston and where they came from. And this map represents that. You can see that, of course, most people are coming from inside Texas, but there are also others coming from Louisiana and Georgia. And then here in this cluster map, it actually shows where people are coming from in Texas to come down into Houston. And I'm sorry that I'm moving fast, but just want to get through there are a lot of maps to look at. So first, this represents all of the residences. Blue are men, red are women, that are kind of spread out over this 1913 map that we used. And then from the biographies, people frequently mentioned what club or lodge that they participated in. And while I would have loved to include all the particulars of those clubs and lodges, I felt like some of it was a little bit in the weeds, since you would have like KOP number 56. I don't know how much that means to a lot of people, but I thought instead maybe representing this through how many people are affiliated with a club and lodge. So if you click on those diamonds, it will tell you who participated in one. And another thing that was that people wrote about in the biographies were which church that they attended. And here is a spread across the 1913 map of the churches themselves. And then I decided to kind of make it a little bit more personal. And so what we did here is that, so for Antioch Missionary Baptist Church, we have, the church, we have where the pastor lives, and then the little dots in red are the people that are attending the church. And did this for kind of like the top 5 most popular churches. So for Antioch, for Bethel Baptist, though they did not actually have a pastor listed in the Red Book at the time. Friendship Baptist Church. Trinity. There you go. And you can, so when you see like kind of this information kind of piled on top of each other, that means that the pastor is living like right next to the church. And then moving on to schools, we have the schools that are across the city. There was actually one that I could not map because I could not figure out where it was located. But that did occur sometimes when going through the data, that it was the directions were not necessarily clear, and there may not always have been street addresses. So, but this is like almost all the schools except one. And then for this, in the kind of school section, there's a listing of all the teachers that teach at them. And so what you see here are for the top, basically the schools with the most teachers, the top 5. And, you can click in here and see more information about the person, for example, like what they taught at the school. You can see how close they may have lived or not lived. Gregory School here. Paul Lawrence Dunbar School. And then Lucky Grade School. Moving on to businesses, there is actually a 10-page directory of business addresses. And this is how they spread out across the city. There were some that went further than the map. There were also some that were really hard to locate, but we tried our best. And this is actually like my favorite map. One thing that I was really surprised by was how many women owned businesses. Mainly restaurants, groceries, and furnished rooms, as they put it. But you can slide this back and forth and get a sense of where they are. Then I wanted to focus on kind of the top 5 businesses that had the most participation. So there's barbers and barbershops. And so if you notice again that the red dot is on top of the purple diamond, and that means that most likely this person is actually running this place out of their home or like right next door. Clothes cleaner and pressers. Express and drayage, and if you're scratching your head, like what is that? Now I think we would call it logistics. And if you're also scratching your head about what that is, it's basically moving things from one place to another. And I found it really interesting that there's kind of below the 3rd ward here, there's a whole bunch that are right here. I'm not exactly sure what the reasoning is on that, but there's lots of things that kind of pop up when you map. You have the groceries, and then restaurants. Many of these restaurants are run by women, and many are run out of their homes. And then moving on to some personal stories in the Red Book. So some people that kind of stood out. When I first looked at the book, the person who caught my eye was a woman named Annie Hagen, who was a midwife, a nurse, also a businesswoman, and she owned 2 properties. Here she is with some of her kids and her husband. And the property that she had next door, she used for her midwifery and nursing business. But later in the city directory, it shows that it's a place for furnished rooms. But another reason why she really stood out to me is that most of the women in the book define themselves through their husbands, and she was the only one who really didn't do that and wrote about herself in the same way that men did, connecting herself to her occupation, as well as to her family. Another one was Edward Pearson Sr. He was a teacher and publisher. This picture I find to be really fascinating. It's one of the only ones that from the Red Book that seems to be taking place in a home. You can see a photograph up in the corner. His parents were both enslaved, and he grew up in Louisiana. He attended Bishop College, where he also learned printmaking. In 1906, he moved to Houston. He eventually taught the Colored High School, was the manager of the Western Star Publishing Co. and managing editor of the Western Star, as it's described in the book as a newspaper for Texas Negro Baptists. One last thing I kind of wanted to leave everyone with is that kind of thinking about, this Red Book is this thing from the past, but how does it kind of map on to our present? And if you see here, you can actually zoom out and see other examples of this on the map, but this is how kind of later on the highway interstate system kind of broke apart these communities. I think Fourth Ward really shows that here with these kind of black dots are places that were, no longer exist because the interstate is in the way, and it kind of separated the community off from each other and then also from downtown. And then to personalize this, oh, that's not the right picture that's supposed to be there. There we go. All right, just to kind of think about this, there's Reverend M.E. Robinson, who was a pastor from Beaumont. And so where he lived now looks like this. We have Sam Sebron, who lived on Nance Street. He lived across the street from Principal Nat Q. Henderson of the B.K. Bruce School. If Sam Sebron was alive today and was able to look across the street, he would now see this. And then also there's just kind of the change that has happened in these neighborhoods. John Brown Bell, who is one of the writers of the book. This is him in front of his property at 2121 German Street. That is now Canal Street. And though it does not necessarily look like it right now, behind me when I took this photograph was a high-rise apartment building. This little thing right here is actually an outdoor movie theater that has been set up. And there's just kind of this lot of gentrification that's happened in this area, which is around Navigation Boulevard. So if you're looking at this and you're like, man, I can make better maps, or I want to do something with this data, well, you can actually go and download it yourself. It is all here, available for whoever wants to do anything with it. And I look forward, I'm going to stop now, and I look forward to taking questions at the end. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Norie. So next we'll have Dr. Cary Wintz. Dr. Wintz, I think you're muted.
There we go. I'm sorry. My assignment was to talk about the Fourth Ward, the history of the Fourth Ward.
We also can't see you, sir.
Okay. There we go. I'll face the camera. The Fourth Ward is not, as we conceive the Fourth Ward today, this is not what it initially was. The Fourth Ward today is kind of an area primarily viewed as really west of downtown and a little bit southwest of the northern part of downtown. The wards were created early in Houston's history as basically city council districts. And initially there were 4 wards. The wards were divided geographically by the across Main Street running north and south and Congress Street running east and west. The 4th ward was on the south of Congress and the west of Main Street. So it covered what is now really the theater district downtown, the library downtown, and then the residential area that would be along West Dallas, and West Gray wasn't quite there yet when it was set up, but ultimately West Gray as well. And it is distinctive from the other wards, at least it was in its early history, because it contained a lot of downtown properties where a number of Blacks, African Americans, had businesses, barbershops, but also law offices and so forth, down south of Congress Street. And so it stretched from the downtown area into the more residential area towards what we now consider the 4th Ward. It was also in the 19th century the location of many of the principal institutions. There was the Negro High School, the Negro Library, that was funded externally. The first Negro hospital, and again, I'm using the terms that they used at that time. And so it had the institutions, it had the professionals, and it had the first schools, particularly the first high school, and it had the first hospital. And if you know much about the history of African Americans in Houston, you know that this would all shift over time into the 3rd Ward. The hospital, Riverside Hospital, the first high school, which was what Ryan Middle School is now, and ultimately which housed the first colored junior college in the 1920s. That is the birthplace of Texas Southern University, which is in the 3rd Ward as well. But for the 19th century, the late 19th century and the very early 20th century, the 4th Ward was sort of the, you can't call it exactly the upper class, because some of the wealthy Blacks lived in the 3rd Ward as well, but it was the sort of the business center and the most prominent area of the African American community. The 4th Ward was, and many of the most prominent African Americans lived in the 4th Ward. Now, over time, this would begin to change. I talked about the 3rd Ward. Also, at the original 4 wards were, again, they were what we would call today city council districts. They were political districts. That's how they were set up. As the city grew, particularly north of the bayou, they added 2 additional wards, the 5th Ward to the northeast and the 6th Ward to the northwest. Both, again, one to the east of Main Street, one to the west of Main Street, but basically on the other side of Buffalo Bayou. The Fourth Ward, though, had a mystique to it that the others did not. It was, as I said, a center of education, a center of medicine, and a center of business. If you could go into a time machine and go back to Houston at this time, in the 19th century, you would find that the Fourth Ward was, it was the place to be. Into the 20th century, even though the Black population became more dispersed, the Fourth Ward evolved, and it evolved into the more entertainment district. I'm sure most of you have heard of the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance, the great cultural, literary, theatrical, musical movement that it is sort of not 100% accurately linked to the beginnings of Black culture. Black culture began far beyond that. But the Harlem Renaissance, the one thing, the problem with the name Harlem Renaissance, while it was centered in Harlem, perhaps, it existed all over the country. And in Houston, if you didn't go to Harlem for entertainment, but you went for the music, you went for the nightlife, you went to the Fourth Ward. And like Harlem itself in New York City, while it was patronized mostly by Blacks, it was not patronized exclusively by Blacks. The sort of with it, white folk also went to listen to live jazz music and drink illicit alcohol. It's during Prohibition in the Fourth Ward at that time. The Fourth Ward, as we have already seen, would suffer in the post-war era. Actually began suffering before World War II. The first institutional attack on the Fourth Ward was the creation of San Felipe Village, which was a federally funded housing project in the late 30s. It was an all-white housing project. It covers it was the Fourth Ward equivalent of Cooney Homes, and it was called San Felipe Courts. And while Cooney Homes was for African Americans, the other two major housing projects, one in the Fourth Ward and one in the Fifth Ward, were for whites. And so that took housing stock. It was taken by the government and the federal government, and it sort of the beginning of the end of the Fourth Ward as far as its real cachet. The second one we've already heard mentioned, the building of the freeway system. And I find it ironic that they're planning now to tear that down. And interesting that the tearing of that down is now being protested by minority communities on the other side of downtown Houston. But those two features, first of all, the housing project took homes away from African Americans. The freeway cut it off from the downtown area, cut it off from the downtown area, isolated it. It also played a role in many of the historic events that took place in Houston. The 1917 riots began in the Fourth Ward. The soldiers who was arrested that sparked that riot was visiting a girlfriend in the Fourth Ward, and he encountered the police and tried to prevent her from being arrested. And that sparked the riot, and the rioters actually marched down what's now San Felipe Street through the Fourth Ward into the downtown area, raising havoc, the soldiers who rebelled. So most, if you talk to most African Americans in Houston at the middle of the 20th century, the Fourth Ward would still be considered kind of, it was the place. And it's hasn't, the city has changed so much since that time. And I've mentioned several things that led to its decline. I think equally important, though, was the decision of African Americans, sometimes also prompted by white patrons who funded these things, to move hospitals and particularly the major educational institutions out of the Fourth Ward. Part of this was natural. In the 1920s, when Houston was booming, there was a bond issue to create new schools. And it's out of this bond issue that they created San Jacinto High School and other high schools for whites. The first iteration of the bond issue failed, mainly because Black voters voted against it. And so they came back and they negotiated with the Black community, and they put it back on the ballot again, but it would also create new Black high schools as well. One basically Wheatley and Yates. And so that again, Wheatley's in the Fifth Ward, Yates is in the Third Ward. So that too helped mark the end of the Fourth Ward. The Fourth Ward is still there today. It's changing even more right now. It's gentrified. It's an example of gentrification. The shotgun houses are being replaced as rapidly as possible by expensive 3-story, 2-story, 3-story townhouses. But it holds on to one thing. It is the location of the library and the African American archives. And so the Fourth Ward still hangs on to its glory in the 21st century.
Thank you, Dr. Wintz. Next, we will have remarks from Dr. Pruitt.
Hi, thank you very much. It's extraordinary being on this panel with my former professor, Cary Wintz. I took my first history class from Cary, I think in the fall of 1986. So it's just, wow, unbelievable.
I can still see you sitting on, she did not sit where everybody else sat. There were a few seats on the side next to the window, and she sat there the whole semester. I can still see her.
Unbelievable, unbelievable. Historian Joe William Trotter tells us that migration is one of the most salient themes in the African American experience. Between 1915 and 1970, 6 to 7 million African descent Americans fled the South, escaping Jim Crow segregation, escaping rural poverty, escaping self-debasement for new horizons in the Midwest, like my grandparents, in the Northeast, and of course, West, primarily in California. But when we look at the Red Book, it challenges that prevailing theme, because the Red Book shows us prominently that hundreds upon hundreds of African American Houstonians in 1915 were born outside of the city. Here's the reality. The majority of African Americans were essentially living in the South. They remained in the South, even when their siblings and cousins and nieces and nephews, and in some instances, parents fled racial segregation. So the Red Book clearly confirms this argument. In fact, scholars such as myself, Tawana Steptoe, Luther Adams, makes the argument that the majority of African Americans are remaining in the South, and African American agency, which is often associated with the Harlem Renaissance, right, in New York, or the Chicago Renaissance in Chicago, or even political mobilization. Our argument, even cultural consciousness, but our argument is that African American agency clearly begins in the South. And in truth, the agency that is highlighted and the agency we're paying homage to tonight, in many ways, truly begins in the rural South among the emancipated former slaves, among their ancestors. And of course, we can link that back to West Africa. It is interesting that the African Americans who are highlighted in the Red Book, as I said a moment ago, are migrants from largely surrounding communities, the Cotton Belt that surrounded Houston, surrounded Western Houston, the mixed economy belt, cotton and lumbering that surrounds I would say probably northeastern Houston. And then you also had significant numbers of African Americans who were fleeing the Northeast Timber Belt. But who were these African Americans? They are the ancestors, the elders of African Americans who are in Houston today. Today, Houston is home to 1.1 million African Americans, and again, I'm speaking of Greater Houston, okay, which encompasses, I think, 7 surrounding counties. When we look at Houston proper, just Houston alone, we're talking about 510,000 African Americans. And this is a community that comprises the descendants of the Red Book settlers, those individuals who migrated to the city during World War II. It includes people like myself, people who are part of the return migrants, the return migrations, African Americans who are often returning home, sometimes in reverse order, okay, back home to the South. It also includes those Caribbean Americans who will make their way into the city, West African Americans who will ultimately make their way into the city in the for Caribbean Americans, West Africans, late 20th century. But the point I'm making, the Houston that is celebrated today as one of the best places for African Americans, and people can point to education levels of African Americans, home ownership among upwardly mobile African Americans, this sense of community agency, all of this, even for those who have come here in the last 30 to 40 years, we can trace those elements of community agency back to those individuals who are highlighted in the Red Book. People like Julia Hester. Julia Hester was the wife of a minister, a graduate of Spelman Institution, which ultimately becomes Spelman College. She was a dedicated school teacher, and upon her death in the 1940s, African Americans created the Hester House, a community center for African Americans. So I think it is very important that we have such a moment like this to remember, consciously remember those elders who gave so much who did not live to see desegregation, who did not live to see the Karen Kasitarnichevs, who will ultimately earn their PhDs from Rice University. But without question, it is because of the prayers and the hopes of these individuals who are highlighted in the Red Book that we ultimately have the Karen Kasitarnichevs, that we ultimately have the Yvonne Davis Freers. So I think I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pruitt. I feel like maybe Dr. Pruitt is also a minister in another life based on how she presented just now. So last but not least, of course, we have Dr. Karen Kasitarnichev, and I want to make a correction. She contributed to the edited volume she edited Recovering 5 Generations Hence, the life and writing of Lillian Jones Horace, and she contributed to the volume African Americans in Central Texas History, edited by Bruce Glassford. So without further ado, here is Dr. Karen Kasitarnichev.
Thank you very much. I am going to pull up a slide presentation. Give me 1 second, please. Okay. Okay, so the Red Book, I remembered being introduced to it, finding out that it was there when I started my graduate studies at Rice University. Now, my initial reason for wanting to look at the book was to see if I could find any trace of African American Pentecostals, the group that I was studying for my PhD dissertation. I was early, this is my first major project in history, and so I was still learning how to do history, and I was even learning how to examine different texts, right? And so the first thing that I want to point out is that, I was reading it from cover to cover, but again, it's a compendium, and it has a lot of historical information in it, but it is not necessarily a historical, it's not a history monograph like you would read something that's focusing on a particular area or person or whatever. So I really had to try to learn how to use it. When in that early phase of my research, I didn't find much on African American Pentecostals. In fact, I didn't find anything. I did find names of people who were affiliated with District B, which is what I'm going to talk about more extensively. So again, as I noticed here, as I note here on the slide, this was one of the first books I perused. Again, it was rich in detail, but there was not much on the subject that I was looking for. So as I continued the research that I was doing, I had to really go to individuals. I had to do a lot of interviews with people, many of whom are no longer with us. Most of the folks that I started interviewing in the 1980s when this idea of doing a book on African American Pentecostals came to mind, I started to interview folks that I knew. And again, most of those people are now deceased. So another thing that I looked at, another project that I tried to find information on was the Works Progress Administration. So there are narratives there. There were narratives that were taken from formerly enslaved African Americans, but there was nothing on African American religion in Texas because, and this is something that happens sometimes, the funds that were used to support this project ran out before they were able to do interviews and to collect any data on Black religion in Texas. Now, those of you who may be familiar with Wallace Best's work on Chicago, well, lucky for him, they had collected a lot of narratives related to African American religion in Chicago, but the same was not true for Texas. For the group that I was looking at, the only scholar who had really paid any attention to African American Pentecostals was Zora Neale Hurston, and most of her research was done on the Southeast coast and not necessarily again in Texas. So I had to look at newspapers, local newspapers for information, but most of it, as I said, came from interviews with individuals or from the personal archives of people whom I met, like Mother Allen, who eventually became Dr. Allen. She was inspired by, I was inspired by all that she was collecting. She was inspired by the fact that I was earning a PhD at Rice, and she decided to work on her Doctor of Ministry at Houston Graduate School of Theology and made history as the oldest student to graduate from there. I also met Glenda Goodson, who had a wonderful collection in her garage that I helped her to organize. She now has a center that she established to study African American Pentecostalism. So what ends up happening is that I find property records, and it's through the property records that I start to look at where these churches are. And the more I looked at them, a lot of them are in District B. So some of the church, one of the first churches I looked at was actually in the Fourth Ward area. It's the oldest African American Pentecostal church, independent Pentecostal church in the Fourth Ward area. It's called Zion Temple Church of Holiness, and now it's New Zion Temple, and it's right on Ruthven and Gillette. And so if you go to the Fourth Ward area, you will still see the church there. It actually has a historical marker. And another very old African American Pentecostal church is in what we call Kashmere Gardens, and that church was established by the late Bishop J.L. Parker. In fact, as I was taking my walk around the park, I ran into one of his senior members who is still lamenting his death. But Bishop Falls in the Fourth Ward area, he becomes the leader of a fellowship that has about 70 churches. It had about 70 churches in it when he was alive. The name of it was a worldwide fellowship. And his younger contemporary, Bishop Parker, he had a lot of what he calls spiritual daughters and sons, but he never tried to establish a denomination. But there are a lot of local people who have what we would call a spiritual connection to his ministry in District B. So what's interesting about Zion Temple, if you look at the zip code, you see 77019. That is where River Oaks is, right? So that was District C. But most of the churches that I looked at, or I discovered as I mapped them, they were in District B. Now, I learned a whole lot more about District B when I ran for Houston City Council, and it was when I had to go to all these different communities. And what was really interesting was to see how people, regardless of where they were in the district, they knew folks in other parts of the district. So the oldest portion of the district that would have been affiliated with early Houston was the Fifth Ward area, okay? And so a lot of activity a lot really happens. Fifth Ward is really important to a lot of cultural, political, and social history, as you will see in a couple of slides. But what I wanted to do is show you the mayors of Houston from 1972 to the present. And the reason I did that was because I wanted you to be aware of the council members who served, who were African American in District B. And so Judson Robinson is the first, and he is a council member from 1972 to 1979. Ernest McGowan from 1980 to 1993. Michael Yarbrough from 1994 to 99. Carol Mims Galloway, Jarvis Johnson. Let me move this thing here. Jarvis Johnson and, Jerry Davis, and now Tarsha Jackson, who's serving District B. When you look at District B, you see, and I want you to compare it to the other two maps that you see to the side. It's sprawling. It's a sprawling district, right? So campaigning in a district that is disjointed in the way that it is pretty hard work. So the freeway system that Carrie mentioned, it cuts through a lot of District B. In fact, Highway 45 does, 45 North, and also 59, I-10, all of these are cutting across District B. And so again, that is going to be part of, that's one of the stories we talk about when we talk about African American communities in Houston being disrupted by the construction of the freeway system. If you compare them to, say, District C, you see a much more manageable kind of area here, and also District D, where Texas Southern University is. You'll see a difference in the mapping in those of those districts. I wanted to just kind of make you aware of some of the names that are associated with District B and faces. We see Judson Robinson, Barbara Jordan, Mickey Leland, Ernest McGowan, Sinfronia Thompson, who's the second longest serving representative in the state of Texas, James Douglas, a former president of the NAACP and also a former president of Texas Southern, Ruth Simmons, and so many. Peacock Records, even for cultural history, in Tawana Steptoe's book, she talks about a lot of the cultural aspects of Houston and in the Fifth Ward area in particular. And again, Carol Mims Galloway and Tarsha Jackson. There are a lot of African Americans who are making major contributions in various areas to cultural and political history who are coming from District B. The area was it's still predominantly African American, but the Latinx community is growing significantly. And you'll also notice that according to the census, the earnings of people in the district are going up. And what we're seeing is more people coming from other parts of the city. Some are moving back, whose parents may have bought homes in various areas of District B. There are also some newer communities that are being established. So the area overall is becoming much more culturally diverse. It was already culturally diverse, but it's even more so. I know the community that my parents bought their home in now, it's for sure about 45% Hispanic, and there are other groups represented as well. And so here you'll see the zip codes that are associated with District B and some of the contemporary issues that you think of when you think of African American life in Houston. You'll see that a lot of them emerged out of District B. For example, I'll look at 77029, where you had, 77078 in the Settegast area. Dr. Robert Bullard of Texas Southern University, he launched the environmental justice movement. Of course, he didn't realize he was launching a movement then, but there was an issue with solid waste, and solid waste management was actually dumping in an area, in a middle-class area in 77078 off of 610. And so that entire, think about it, he's gotten an award from the United Nations, and that project started in District B in a predominantly African-American community. There are other things that are in District B that some people are not aware of. Houston, the airport is in District B. Also in 77029, there's an ongoing study from Professor Deanne King. They're looking at air quality in Pleasantville. And I already mentioned Sinfronia Thompson, who's the second longest serving representative for the state of Texas. She's out of District B. And of course, our mayor, Sylvester Turner, also hails from District B, from the Acres Homes area. So it's a very rich area. Ruth Simmons as well, I already mentioned. There are a lot of people, a lot of events that are significant to African American history that happen in this, in the District B region. So the final statement is that it is ripe for an in-depth study, and the question is, who's going to do it? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Kossie-Chernyshev. Okay, so now we're to the point that I think people are most interested in, our audience is most interested in, and that is asking questions of our panelists. So I'd like to remind everyone again, please use the Q&A feature. We have some questions there already to ask questions of our panelists, and I will help moderate these questions and get them to the right person to answer them. So we already had questions coming in pretty much from the beginning. So I'm not even going to do what I usually do, which is I usually cheat and get in line first and ask my own question, but in the interest of getting to some of these other ones. So Josh Furman says, this is an amazing project. What do you think are some of the more interesting findings or conclusions we learn about Houston's Black community at this time by mapping all of this data? So I think probably Norie is the first person who should answer, but I think because our panelists are familiar with the source, if everyone could say a little something about what our audience members can gain from looking at the Red Book as a source. So go ahead and kick us off, Norie.
Yeah, ultimately, I think, presenting that data is in the hopes that other experts can look at it and get their own information. But one thing I think that I mentioned while I was presenting was kind of the rate of female business ownership was really high. I thought that was just, interesting, and that, many of those were taking place like in the home or next to the home. I just, for me, that kind of really struck out when I was going back to that data and I saw that kind of pop out. I was quite surprised. I mean, pleasantly surprised. So.
Dr. Pruitt, you seem like you want to say something. Yeah, please.
No, I was just going to point out that certainly this collaborative project shows us that it is a diverse African-American community. It's very interesting that in the 21st century, we're grappling with issues of race and caste and where do African-Americans fit in this country. This is an ongoing question. Historically, this has been an ongoing question. But it's interesting that when you go back 50 years after emancipation, Blacks are opening businesses. They are committed to teaching their children. It is Reverend Nellum, I believe, or Pelham, Reverend Ned Pelham, who in 4th Ward will help to establish People's Sanitarian in 1911. And that in many ways becomes a precursor to Houston Negro Hospital that opened in 1927. So African Americans are determined to prove to the world that they are legitimate, that they are deserving of citizenship, equity, even while masking their feelings and their frustrations and anger, because this is 1915 during the period of Jim Crow segregation. Thank you.
Dr. Kossie-Chernyshev, would you like to chime in?
Yes, I was trying to find the page in the Red Book that really stood out for me. It was in one of the first sections where the writer was making it very clear that he was not trying to write a race narrative, and he was actually saying that the races, as he described them, were getting along well. And I was reading that and going, wow. So in 1915, when this book is being published, he's talking about the races, quote, getting along, and it just kind of struck me, especially given a lot of the discussion that we have now, the discussions that we're having now about race. And so it's interesting to read how the editor was thinking about race relations that early in Houston. I found it really striking, especially given, again, some of the developments that we will definitely have, and that we're certainly in the center of Jim Crow. And in fact, at that time, some are describing this period as the nadir of African American history. So I just found that pretty striking. I was just trying to find those pages. Perhaps before we finish, I'll find the exact section. But if you read the introduction, you'll see it's at the beginning of the narrative where he's describing what his project is, what his aim is.
And after that introduction, Emmett Scott presents a narrative. So again, if Emmett Scott, who is a native Houstonian, who is Booker T. Washington's personal secretary, right? If he's part of this, certainly African-American appeasement is going to be central. Do you think they would have been able to publish this if they were NAACP activists? Mm-hmm. Yes or no? Although there's another argument that comes to mind, but I will I'll save that for a little later. But an excellent point, Karen. Dr.
Well, I just found it necessary to say, don't expect any. You just got the impression that, well, don't expect any protests kind of language coming out of this book. That's not what this is about. But I have to say that I appreciate it. Some of it may be part of the kind of Zora Neale Hurston approach. The world is my oyster, and I'm going to take out a pearl, and I'm just not going to pay attention to some of the horrific things that actually may be happening. So there was this sense that, yes, you dealt with certain kinds of issues if you were African American, but you certainly weren't going to talk about them or make a big deal about them. So I'm just wondering where some of that, whether it's part of that tradition of standing strong and moving forward and just not paying attention in an open way to the discriminatory environment that they were certainly living through.
I'd like to just add a couple of things. First of all, I liked what Karen talked about myth and so forth. And the one thing I always told my students, and I'm sure Bernadette remembers this: history is not what you think it is; it's what you find it to be. Mm-hmm. And that we do have to move beyond the myths. I mean, the Red Book is a tremendously rich source of information, but it also has some pretty significant flaws. There is a statement on page 3 that basically is embracing segregation and racial separation, and urging people not to challenge the racial segregation of the time. I'm sure most of you know that there were a number of red books done on different communities. And there were also a number of blue books done. There's a blue book of Houston that came out about the same time. And so this was it was a commercial venture, really to sell subscriptions and make money. But I don't know if this was their intention or not, but they provided a truly wonderful source for future historians. But they were certainly not challenging in any sense the status quo, the racial status quo. And they strive, I think, to be very apolitical on that feature. And I was I was stunned when I saw that little snippet in there that is urging people not to challenge racial separation.
Yeah. And that, no, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that, keep in mind, this is 1915. 2 years later, we're going to have the Houston riot. And actually, there are actors in the Red Book who will distance themselves from many of the central players here. Two people who come to mind are Henry Mims, born in Brazoria County in the 1870s, moves to Houston. He is hired by the post office, and Mason Patton is also hired by the post office in 1913 in Chattanooga. They are going to establish the Federal Postal Office Employees Union. This union is still in existence today. And then this is in 1913 when they established the union, actually. But later they will help to establish the Houston branch of the NAACP. That's in 1918. So there is a consciousness, and Mims and Mason Patton are cognizant of the Wilson administration and how the Wilson administration in 1913 segregates everything. So this is why they established this Federal Postal Workers Association. So on the surface, certainly everybody's adhering to appeasement. What choice do they have? But underneath the surface, there are layers of tension, without question.
Bernadette, I wasn't saying the Houstonians were doing that. I was saying the people who put the book together.
Oh, yes.
They were a commercial venture. They did not want to get kicked out of the city.
Yes.
So they made it very clear that they were trying to be apolitical. But on the other hand, by creating the book, they were political.
Yeah.
Well, the fact that they would even need to say that they're being apolitical suggests that.
That's not surprising in 1915. The 3 years later, you have some of the worst racial violence in American history.
Mhm.
And you have Houston's big riot 2 years later.
Exactly.
And the Houston riot is not a typical riot. It is actually an attack on the white community by people fed up with racial discrimination and violence against their comrades.
But we also have to keep in mind that in Houston, Black educators and professionals were trying to implement Washingtonian philosophy, right? The whole fingers on a hand. They really are trying to make that work. And so you will find that it takes a moment for some of the leaders to actually embrace more progressive ideas as far as segregation is concerned. And so it's great that the Red Book is there because you can actually see from whence we've come, right? And the other thing that you see is that you do have African American professionals, leaders, fully engaged and making the best out of the Jim Crow world that they live in. And so
Well,
the fact that
I'd say even more, they're creating a world, and they're creating a city within a city.
Yeah.
You're right. I agree 100%.
We've had a number of questions about how folks can research their own families or use the Red Book in conjunction with census materials or those kinds of questions. So if any of our panelists would like to speak to how someone might turn to the Red Book to try to fill in the details of their lives and connect it to other kinds of records. You're nodding your head, Dr. Pruitt, please go ahead.
Yeah, I was actually trying to get in contact with Mrs. Horton's, I think her last name is Patrick. She is the granddaughter of Henry Mims, a retired school teacher, Prairie View graduate who's actually doing a family history, looking at her family and her grandfather's legacy. So certainly the Red Book provides you with a basis to study and familiarize yourself with Black Houston. Certainly, for me, it was about understanding who these individuals were, tracing their birthplaces, and then trying to find these individuals in the census. So these individuals, people like John Bell, who was born in, I think he was born in 1859. So these individuals are certainly going to be in the 1900 census, 1910 census, 1920 census. And then for individuals who were either emancipated as children or they're the children of emancipated slaves, those individuals will more than likely make their transition in the 30s, 40s. So the point I'm making, you can locate individuals by finding them in the census. So finding them in the Harris County census for, let's say 1920, and then moving backward. And because the Red Book tells you where these individuals were born, now you know you can go to that county manuscript census. So the census is a godsend. So are city directories.
I was going to say, pay attention to the places that are located, that are already there, that are listed. That's a great way to start because history happens in a place. People live in a place, so pay attention to those spaces. So if you know that a relative grew up in one of the wards that's covered in the Red Book, well, you know that you at least have a beginning there, and you can begin to explore that particular place.
Thank you. Do we have one of the attendees wants to know if we have any sense of how much of the Black population of Houston in 1915 is represented in the Red Book, right? So is it, does it represent, yeah, right, a percentage based on what we know, or, right? Oh, Norie has popped in.
I looked it up when I saw that question, because the population is given in the Red Book as 30,000. And so based on the data that I was able to take out of kind of mappable people, there are people that are mentioned, but like maybe they don't have a first name. There's just an initial, like it's hard to find who they are. There's approximately 900 that I mapped. So so it's not a nearly like complete view, but it is a smaller percentage, but it's still not bad. It's not a bad number.
I think it's important to remember too that that the city of Houston is annexed in the 1940s. I think it's 1948. So there are Black people just beyond the perimeters of the areas covered by the Red Book who are living, breathing, having children, and all of that. So you're only getting a portion of the African American community represented in the book. But the Black community in Houston, what becomes Greater Houston, is much larger.
Very good point. I think it's in 1947 when Houston expands, but you have Independence Heights, which is north of 4th Ward. It is annexed in 1929, but it is an incorporated community going back to 1915. Black-owned homes, business persons who are represented in the Red Book. I think it's fair to say also that the Red Book represents probably the upper middle class, the middle class, affluent African Americans.
Right.
So one might say, well, there are going to be people who are invisible. That is true to an extent, but their churches are represented. But still, one could say, well, maybe the storefront churches are not represented. Maybe these are the elite churches that are represented. But then you can look at other sources, such as welfare applications. That would provide you with an oasis of material that does pay homage to working class African Americans. Obituaries. So you can use a Red Book in conjunction with other sources to begin to map out Black Houston in its totality, I think.
Black cemeteries as well. Yeah, there are a number of Black cemeteries in Houston. And if you just take a drive through Houston, and particularly in throughout District B, you will find a lot of rural land, so you can see where people, they had the house, but then there was always a lot on the side. The Cashmere Gardens area, for example, you will find a lot of houses with an extra lot. Well, what was that extra lot for? It was to plant a garden, to grow things, right? And so, or there are other places that are still, again, inside Houston, inner city, where you will find, horses being kept, right? Because a lot of that was considered, quote, the country before the city expanded in the 1940s. So you'll still, Houston is the Red Book is a great introduction, but there's so much more beyond that you're able to explore, especially once you move out of the chronological perimeter of the Red Book, which is 1915.
The other thing to remember is that the Houston that existed when that book was done changed radically after World War II. I remember, because I'm older than all of you, when I was a child, and we, like 8, 9, 10 years old, and we would drive to Galveston, and you couldn't there was no freeway connector where the 45 thing is. Then you drove along the street, and that was driving the same thing as driving down West Dallas. What's the third ward, east of Main Street, all along there was we had as many shotgun houses and little groceries and everything else that the 4th Ward had. And so the Red Book focuses mainly on the 4th Ward. It's interesting, but not exclusively. But all of these things changed, and they changed because we saw with the 4th Ward, institutions, a white housing project, a freeway, along the Third Ward. What was in the heart of the Third Ward, much closer to downtown than TSU is, are Cooney Homes. Cooney Homes was built as a Black housing project, but the area to the north of that was shotgun houses, and you know, a thriving Black working class community.
Well, I see that the hour is growing late, and I want to be respectful of the time of our panelists and of our attendees. So I'd like to thank all of you for these wonderful presentations and for sharing some important history about the city that we live in, and for some of us, the communities that we're from. So I'd like to thank all of our panelists for these really thoughtful presentations. Again, I point our attendees to the links that I put in the chat so that you can access some of this information yourself. So if you would like to learn more about what's in the Red Book and to do some of your own research, perhaps academic, perhaps personal. But again, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to all of, I'm so sorry we could not get to these questions. The attendees were fast and furious in their typing. I feel terrible that we couldn't get to all of these questions, but I think it goes to show how interested people are in this resource and in the information that our panelists provided this evening. So thank you so much for joining us, and have a good evening, everyone.
Thanks, Faye and Norie, for inviting us.